Hello and welcome to the first video that I have ever made. This video is part 2 of a 2-part submission for my master's degree in design features at RMIT, based in Melbourne. Part 1 of my submission focused on different aspects to design leadership. So I looked at the design of business, the relationship between design and business, and the importance of design to understand the context of business. I looked at mindset as a driver of other capabilities, exploring intent and mindset and how they overlay for a designer, and how we might start to channel mindset to build on other capabilities, heading towards a design-led future. My third area of investigation was looking at holistic thinking, so very much based on the work of Dan Hill, looking at the detail between interaction design strategy and the gamut of space in between those, as where designers and design leaders need to live and breathe and navigate in order to produce effective work. For part 2 of my assignment, I have chosen to interview 5 design leaders that I admire. I was interested in testing the 3 different aspects I explored in my first part submission. And I designed questions around each of those 3 facets with a view to broaden my experience even further and, in a sense, challenge what I'd written about in my first article. Each of the leaders that I interviewed offered something incredible to my understanding of design leadership that I would like to share as part of this submission. I've rethought a lot of the things that I wrote in Article 1, which I'll reflect on as part of this submission, with a view to better understand my practice, but also outside of my practice, look at what design leaders are experiencing and the challenges that they're looking at. The interviews have all been filmed via video conference, so the quality isn't fantastic, but I've done my best to communicate the message as a story as strongly as possible. So I hope you enjoy it. Thank you for watching.
I see my role, there's a couple of different ways that I see my role. So one of them is to maintain a kind of quality across the work we're doing, and look at the kind of methods and approach that we do to take and how that's going in reality on projects. One of them is to be a sort of sounding board and a kind of parent, I guess, for those people. And the other is to try and make time to slow down and reflect on what we're doing. And to my other part of my role is I'm the Fjord Evolution lead for APAC as well. So Fjord Evolution is Fjord's internal learning experiences and leadership development groups. So there's only a small group of us, and we go around to every studio, and we do what we call a kind of baseline academy for new starters. So everyone who joins gets to go through this 2-day workshop. For me, in terms of the different layers, there's a sort of global thing which we're trying to take care of and sort of have that shared language, and that's important. There's this kind of split personality between, you know, the stuff that, say, Accenture needs as a business or Fjord needs as a business to understand, and sort of keeping some of that away from our teams, but sort of guiding them. But there's also a thing that's built into me from very long, I think it's probably I'm sure it's from school actually, is I have I like to think of it as a healthy disregard and dislike of bureaucracy. There's an inherent tension in leadership positions between, and this is a thing I learned through teaching. So if you're teaching a group of people, they have to feel, it's a bit like riding a horse. They have to feel confident that the person standing at the front is confident in what they're doing. If you've ever been in a kind of situation where someone's teaching and it feels like they don't know what they're doing, I mean, you remember it from school, right? The teacher who was a little bit kind of nervous and would lose control immediately and just be chaos. In a sort of adult teaching environment, it's you know, just doesn't inspire the sort of confidence and you know, sort of engagement, I think, and you know, people just switch off. And I think I really learned. I think there's a similar thing in kind of mentoring teams, as they in sort of leadership, they really have to feel like you know what you're doing, and sometimes just someone needs to make a decision. It doesn't kind of even matter what the decision is; just someone needs to make a decision and be kind of decisive about that. So I think the shift that's going on in education, that's also probably going on in management, certainly going on in design, is in education it's called you might have heard this term of the shift from the sage on the stage to the guide by the side. And it's true of design, and I think a lot of leadership too, where it's actually more about facilitating than it is about telling people. I think the mistake about leadership is often it's understood to be, I tell you what to do. There's a thing that goes on that I really experience with leadership, and I experienced it at Animal Logic actually, where I was moving into a sort of a leadership role. So I was the interactive director there, and you lose your you start letting go of your craft skills, and you're just learning sort of leadership skills. So there's a kind of dip in the middle for a leader where you're sort of rubbish at both, and it's quite challenging to the sort of existentially and to the ego. I think the sort of fundamental thing, though, is it's kind of designly, but it's also very normal. It's just to remember these are humans and human beings. And to try and reconnect people on that level is a really important thing. It's quite easy on a project or when you've got different roles to end up in a situation where you sort of start dehumanizing each other, and not because it's kind of work and not, you know, social life, not actually taking seriously and recognizing the emotional and psychological things that are going on in the room. And there's this look, which I used to see in my students, I sometimes see it in my in the teams here, where everyone is sort of slightly hunched over and sitting in front of walls of post-it notes, and they're just stuck, right? They just don't know where they're going with it. And there's this kind of desire to what's the right way to kind of synthesize this? What's the right method? What should we be doing? And actually, the real answer to that isn't, you know, method X. The real answer is just something. Just do anything. And with writing, you just keep writing, or you start cutting stuff. But I think it's what's going on a human level is this kind of half-formed kind of fermenting stuff in people's heads, and it can make people really anxious. And if they externalize that and onto other people in the team, or sometimes with the client, it can get really destructive really quickly. So I think that thing of kind of naming it and recognizing that we're at this point in time, like internally it's easier because you can say to a design team, look, we're at this kind of ambiguous state, we're in the soup of things, we're going to come out through the other side, we know we will, we always do. Let's just get started. If we find that this way of sorting the data is wrong, then we'll choose another way. My wife's a psychoanalyst. She's a psychotherapist, rather. She's a Jungian analyst, and both of us have done analysis for many, many years. And it's a thing that I think that I think the world would be a better place if everyone did it. I think Donald Trump could certainly do it. And so I think that kind of self-awareness and understanding, even, you know, you never really kind of fully solve your issues, but you become much more aware of them and what's kind of pushing your buttons, or at least have a kind of space to talk about those. And that, for me, that's, I know other people have kind of, you know, leadership coaches and professional coaches, and I've had those too, and it's kind of like a kind of professional therapist. It depends who those people are, right? Sometimes they're quite good. Sometimes it's a little bit like, yeah, but you're not actually kind of engaging with the emotional part of what I'm dealing with. And that's what drives us all. But I guess the thing I do most of professionally is I just walk around and speak to people. I spend quite a lot of time. Sometimes I have this real guilt trip at the end of the day where I think, well, all I've really done is kind of wandered around and chatted to people today. But I think that's quite an important part of the getting the temperature of kind of how things are going, but also having that kind of a contact and demonstrating the fact that you're engaged. And I am genuinely engaged. It's not just like I'm walking around cruising the floor for the sake of it. I'm just kind of curious about what people are doing. So I think one of the things for sort of aspiring design leaders, sort of know thyself is a really important thing. I think you have to really spend a lot of time understanding yourself as a human being and understanding how that sort of manifests in your sort of behavior and what you do. And because I think all of that helps give you the radar for seeing what's going on in other people. There's a thing I learned from teaching, but also sort of has been useful in parenting, which is knowing when does this person need you to kind of step in and actually do something for them. Most of the time it's not that often. And when does this person just need sort of permission to do the thing that they know is really the thing they should be doing, and when you need to kind of draw that out of them. So sometimes people don't really kind of know what it is that they should be doing. They sort of do, but it's locked sort of deep inside of them. And so you have to kind of have a conversation that draws that out. I mostly think that's what it's about. I really don't think it's my view is that there's no difference in design leadership. There shouldn't be any difference between design leadership and any other kind of leadership. I think most of it's around that. I think all the other kind of management guff is a sort of smokescreen for, and often a sort of shield and a suit of armor from actually engaging with the human. You don't always have to be a leader, I think. And I don't actually really, I'm a design director here, right? So, but I don't, I'm part of a leadership team, I'm part of the global leadership team at Fjord. I think it's also okay to say, do you know what, I want to just be, I maybe want to sort of lead my discipline or craft skill. I don't necessarily have to be kind of running teams. I think that thing I talked about was sort of giving up your craft skills and then sort of learning management skills. I think it's okay to say, I don't want to do that. I would love that to be more culturally acceptable. There's a thing someone sent to me years ago, which was the disappointing thing about growing up is realizing that adults don't have all the answers. And I think there's a sort of a parallel with that with leadership, that you kind of think everyone at the top knows what they're doing, and everyone's actually just making it up as they go along.
Starting with where I am today, I'm the Vice President of Strategic Design at BCG Digital Ventures. And I guess it's the culmination of nearly 2 decades of traversing through a range of different aspects of design. I think if I had to say one thing that's probably consistent across my career is that I've had job titles that haven't previously existed in most of the roles I've been in. What BCG Digital Ventures does is invent, launch and scale game-changing businesses with some of the world's largest corporations and most important businesses. That requires leadership of multidisciplinary people. So this is not just leadership of designers, but it's leadership of extensive multidisciplinary teams from multiple organizations to bring something together that is truly new, that's truly groundbreaking, and that can truly drive value. You know, at the heart of great design, you know, regardless of what discipline it comes from, are great people. And so finding, nurturing, growing the right talent is absolutely crucial to any kind of leadership role. I think it's recognizing that design-led is not the only approach, and that there will often be other approaches which at first glance might seem almost antithetical. For example, if you're taking a very hypothesis-led approach to finding a new opportunity or a new solution. But I think as a leader, it's important to recognize that actually bringing together those multiple different approaches can create something that is incredibly powerful. What's at the core of a design-led approach is, this is seen throughout things like double diamond theory and many of the other well-established models, is keeping as expansive as possible for as long as possible before narrowing down on a hypothesis. In many other approaches, it's racing as fast as possible to find an initial solution and then iterating on that until something becomes evident that your hypothesis is not true. So if I think of what we do at DV, we're coming up with game-changing businesses that haven't been created. And so for us, if we look at a typical venture capital deal flow, all the way from the start of ideas through to various rounds of funding, very small incremental funding rounds that happen, there's a lot of risk involved. What we find is that by taking that very design-led approach with rich customer insights and keeping those hypotheses as expansive as possible, but then doing iterative testing and refinement with customers, that effectively de-risks the funnel and means that you accelerate the pathway to having a more highly validated product or service, which means that actually your cost to get to market and launch with, whether it's an MVP or a full market launch, overall actually becomes less because of how design de-risks that process. Design is becoming more connected in a more obvious way to business value. And so part of that for me has been going, how do you then transition not just to do design, but how do you sell design? How do you communicate design? And how do you do that in business terms that executives and boards can understand? Sort of transition point is really hard because you have to at some point make a decision. Am I going to be that craftsperson and really refine my craft and stay deep in design? Or am I going to go the more general leadership route and, become, how do you become someone who can actually lead in a more strategic and commercial way? One was growth, the other was grit, and the third was flow. And so I think, having a growth mindset is absolutely critical, both to designers. I think if we are going in with the aspiration and the hunger to keep on learning and developing and exposing ourselves to new and different processes, practices, experiences, people, outcomes, I think that's absolutely critical to anyone working in today's world. The second one that came to me was grit. And, I think for me what that is that tenacity, the passion, the resilience to thrive in highly ambiguous, ever-changing situations. The third thing that came to mind was the notion of flow. This has been written about extensively, but that ability to get in the zone, that mindset of being able to, elevate yourself a little bit away from the busyness of day to day and get yourself into a zone where you're actually in the right frame to do the type of design you need to do at that point in time. It's probably an area where I've personally had to go through a tremendous amount of growth in recent years. And I think just in terms of the demands of the kinds of roles that I've been in, the kinds of sort of work that I've done, being able to actually replenish yourself and find the space to actually do that is increasingly challenging. The things that help me probably the most are things like yoga. When I get round to meditation, although I'm admittedly nowhere near as sort of religious about that as should be, you know, something that's an ongoing challenge and challenges a lot of sort of workplace norms in terms of what people do, the demands of various, whether it's projects or initiatives or, you know, just competing demands, is how do you actually craft the time and space to be able to do those things. And, you know, I think admittedly it's not easy, is probably, I would say it's that side of it, certainly from my perspective, has been one of the most challenging things. But I'm learning increasingly that, you know, unless you do that, and I mean, you know, classic Stephen Covey from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, where he talks about sharpening the saw. You know, this is, I think, something that I've personally made a commitment to really focus on more, because I know that will make me a better leader and a better designer. I think one of the things that I'm quite excited about, which is a little bit of full circle for me, is having started my design career initially as an information architect and looking at, you know, how do you build ontologies of information so that they can be navigated through search? How do you, you know, create taxonomies that are human-centered but machine-readable? I was involved in various metadata standards committees, and we're now kind of going, how do we as designers design not just for the human interface, but for the machine interface? And I think that's really exciting when we start to look at the future of AI, when we start to look at intelligent bots, when we start to look at how experiences in the future might happen more machine to machine than human to machine. The world is going to change so much, and that just brings incredible opportunities and challenges. I don't think it'll be easy. I think it's going to be, you know, definitely periods of flying blind and navigating in the dark. But I think what an amazing context to try and design in. So I guess for design leaders of the future, I'd sort of really go, what are the morals and ethics of design? What is your responsibility as a designer to design for good?
CityLab is an in-house service design and human-centered design team for local government. It sits within what we call a smart city office. And really the remit of CityLab and the smart city office is to try to help the city of Melbourne shift its thinking and be disruptive in an environment that is changing extremely fast, not only in regards to what technology is available to us and how we can actually engage with the community, but also the makeup of our community itself. As far as university and study, I studied ecology and environmental systems, as well as evolution, and took that study and ended up getting a master's degree in urban habitat management. And what that means was really the crux of that study was thinking about urban cities and city developments as ecosystems and trying to understand them from a system perspective. Leadership is a funny thing. It's a big word. The thing I love about Melbourne, Melbourne itself, we're a progressive city, and the stance we take is to try to lead within the local government sector, within the way we operate and what we do. Saying it is much easier than doing it. And one of our challenges from a CityLab perspective is helping to bring people onto the journey of working in a different way. And and questioning what they do. So we do, from a leadership perspective, a huge role that I need to play and that the team needs to play is how we help people see opportunity, and to remove, I suppose, the fear of change, and working in a different way and trying to explore how the services we provide might transform. And that's a really hard task, because it's convincing people from all levels of the organization to take a bit of a step in a new direction. In particular, working in a design-led way, we don't know where we're headed. Or actually, we know where we're headed, but we don't know how we're going to get there and what it looks like when we do. And that can be a really scary thing from a government perspective. Certainty is valued. Risk mitigation is valued. And working, how you actually bridge that divide, and helping people understand taking an iterative and testing approach to creating new services is something that we really need to work on, to help people feel comfortable and confident to keep moving forward. From a government and just large organization perspective, traditional leadership, it's hierarchical, it's reactive, it's kind of command and control, and that worked really, really well in the past. You knew exactly what needed to get done. You could create linear processes to manage that, and you could continue to churn out the jobs that needed to get done on a day-to-day basis, and manage risks in a reactive way quite productively. Things are changing so fast that form of leadership is just too slow, and the operational models that form of leadership manifests is also not really fit for purpose. So I think we need to shift to a more generative mindset, how we actually, the answers don't have to come from the top down, nor should they. How do we enable the entire organization to be a part of the process of actually trying to come up with new ideas and solutions that can respond to the daily new challenges that, especially from a city perspective, we face. So mindset is vitally important. How we bring people together, connect them on the work that we're going to do, becomes quite critical. And again, similar to what I was talking about with leadership, our role as kind of the team that's embodying this new way of working, we need to live and breathe those mindsets ourselves, and to remind ourselves when we're falling out of perhaps being closed or applying our own expectations or assumptions. And so we have a really strong reflective practice to make sure that we're constantly in tune with each other and the way that we're feeling across a project. One thing that does reflect for me is quiet reflection. It's hugely important in the way that I operate. And I find my best work and the way that I can recharge where I'm at and how, if I reach a roadblock on anything that I'm trying to achieve, shifting my focus and immersing myself in something completely different is usually where I get my breakthroughs. And I apply that both personally and professionally in anything I do. Really tight time frames, big problems. The harder you focus on it, the faster you might get to an outcome, when in reality, sometimes the best thing you can do is to drop everything and walk away and focus on something completely mundane or different or more interesting. And that's when all of a sudden you found what you were searching so hard for. A lot of people, you can ask them what their core values are, and that's something that can be extremely hard to actually know off the top of your head and feel really confident in, because it requires a lot of reflection and it requires a lot of soul searching that not a lot of people have done. And so I think speaking of leadership and mindset, that's another really important aspect, is actually just helping people understand what their internal compass looks like and where it's pointed, and how they use that to then actually apply to everything they do. I'm really, really keen on us starting to completely shift the way that we think about the way that government serves the community. So what do I mean by that? We often talk about a service being picking up waste or fixing a pothole or building a building or immunizing our children, whatever it might be. But for me, those are all tied into higher level understanding of service, where it's actually the value that we provide the community by making them safe, keeping them well, ensuring the city is vibrant and lively. These are the elements of actually what we do as a public service, and how all of those disparate interactions and actions and activities and plans and strategies fit together is more important than anything else. And that's the best way that we're going to actually break down barriers and connect is, I'm trying not to use buzzwords like human centricity, but by deeply understanding how we add value and why that's so important to the community today, but also into the future, will actually start to hopefully drive a huge shift in the way that we plan what government does, how it does it. Be patient. Be confident. Not egotistical. There's a difference. And share your passion, because it's those things that attract people, build momentum, and actually enable you to drive a movement. Like I said, and I'm taking a government perspective, really great. I've spoken to designers. I've read some really, really great opinion columns. People can become quite frustrated by the need to massive stakeholder engagement, facilitating dialogue, and it can feel like actually I'm not designing. I'm not really focusing on doing and creating. I know. But in fact, it's hugely important, because those are future designers, future allies. That's the community that you're going to need for anything that you create to actually be used and successful. So for me, having that patience and that enthusiasm to bring people on the journey is so important when you're trying to shift systems and organizations and groups which have been working and operating in a particular way for quite a long time.
My trade, if you like, is a strategic designer. Originally, actually more like an interaction designer or service designer, so doing lots of digital product and service design. But I've always had an interest also in cities. My master's was in urban sociology, and so at some point it became possible to combine this interest in cities and spaces and places with my experience in, I guess, design and technology in one way or another. And when you get to a certain age, that also means you start engaging with the organization or the strategy around whatever it is you're designing, whether it's a place or a space or a phone or a website or an organization, that kind of thing. So ultimately, I'm a designer, and the object of the work that I do can be lots of different things depending on context. But ultimately, I'm usually zooming from the details of interactions and services and things up to the context, what I call the dark matter of organization or strategy or vision or regulation or cultural context, that kind of stuff. I'm a leader or a manager, I guess, and I have been for quite a long time now, since I suppose the early 2000s when I was at the BBC and I was running big teams, software engineers and interaction designers and things like that. I guess when I was CEO of Fabrica as well, that's done a lot of work thinking about the environments that the team works within. So perhaps because I'm a designer and a leader, this sense that almost everything is connected, which is sometimes overwhelming, but fascinating, is kind of the way that I approach that leadership. So the relationship between the strategy and the people and the space and the tools and the way we present ourselves in public and the way we work in private, all of those things are really, I see as the kind of material of leadership in that sense. So the other thing that I guess I then do is I do work a lot sort of at a leadership level, as in my clients are working at that level, or my contacts or collaborators are. So I'm often working in their leadership context as well and trying to help them figure out what that might be with my team, and using design as part of that, and the particular skills design has around making things tangible and integrating things and dealing with stewardship and also ambiguity and all of these things. That's often a lot of what we're doing, is helping our client figure out how to effectively lead their own enterprise in that way. Your average city council is largely in a shape that someone from the 19th century would recognize. Maybe 20th century if we're being charitable, but really not in the right shape to address 21st century problems or opportunities. So yes, there's absolutely no doubt, I think, that the leadership context is not framed appropriately for the 21st century. And then some of the skills that go along with that, or the culture of that, also is problematic. So particularly understanding how to, say in a public context, make policy, which is kind of leadership, very direct kind of leadership. The policy making tools and environment is really from another age. Whether that's the way that you understand the problem or opportunity in the first place and then conceptualize a solution and then work that through to something you could deliver, and then even how you might measure or value it. All of those things are usually working in a very kind of perhaps late 20th century context at best. So usually policy making only has economic tools to hand when it's evaluating success of things, and usually really basic ones as well, like cost-benefit analysis. They don't really have any understanding of public value, for instance. The practice has no understanding of user-centered approaches or prototyping or iteration, stewardship, things like that, which we know works well in many other contexts. And then, again, the form itself, how people relate to each other, is still very kind of siloed and vertical and discipline-based in an old sense, that isn't terribly helpful for the 21st. I think you could equally say there's massive issues with the way that the private sector is undergoing leadership as well, whether it's our current bête noire of tech entrepreneurs who clearly are optimized to do some things very well in the 21st century, but are laying waste to tons of things around them. So you'd argue, when you look at the balance sheet, if you like, sorry to use an economics term, that's not appropriate leadership often. So in terms of how I'd interpret that word, it describes a kind of a stance or an approach to understanding a situation or context or people or place. And as I just said before, I suppose, it feels like the way that our leaders are trained and also encouraged to be through media or thought leadership. We don't have the kind of subtlety and focus on practice that we need for the 21st century challenges. I think that the mindset is quite an interesting kind of lasso around a bunch of things, which includes training and practice and positioning and stance and your role within an organization. But it doesn't feel appropriately tuned for what we're dealing with now. One thing about being a designer or having a designerly approach to things, I guess. I always remember the book by Chip Kidd called The Cheese Monkeys, which is a book about graphic design, but it's a novel, and at some point in the novel, teacher says to one of the kids, as a designer, you've got to eat the world with your eyes. And it's that sense of kind of everything is going in all the time. So everything you see around you, because you tend to see in this very integrated, holistic way, is effectively kind of grist to the mill. It's part of the sort of an everyday ongoing research. Now, it's not specific research, it's not kind of focused research to address a particular problem. That's a quite different thing, obviously. And then something you do professionally. But I do think there's something about this kind of blurred personal private approach which is interesting, because it just again means that you're hyper aware, hyper sensitized to the way that systems are playing out in everyday life, particularly I suppose if you work to do with cities, which mine is. You spend a lot of time in them, but you're going to be basically seeing those systems at work all the time. It's difficult not to think about that, even if it's the weekend or you're with your kids or your wife or in the pub or whatever. This is very, very blurred, and sometimes that's unhealthy, as in it's sometimes difficult to switch off, and I'm as bad at that as anybody, I guess, and I'm maybe not as bad as anybody. I do take active measures around those sort of things. I'm massively interested in designing for focus and well-being. That's one of our current projects. However, I think the particular kind of practice I've chosen, which is a designer and then one who does a lot of writing, means that you're inevitably engaged with all of those subjects every single moment, one way or another. I think one of the things that's interesting now is how organizational forms are increasingly networked and blurred, and that has a different effect on leadership. So what's interesting now is beginning to see how people are shifting, and have been for some time, through multiple careers, never mind through multiple jobs, switching careers several times during their lifetime, having elongated lifetimes, working in many, many different ways, having kind of portfolio careers where you're doing several things simultaneously. I can see that even within my team, there are some who have an art practice that they do 2 days a week and then 3 days a week with me, and might teach 1 day a week and do 4 days a week with me. So that's hard if you're trying to work in a traditional 20th century organizational way. So I'm interested in how do we flex in that direction. Equally, more radically, I suppose, then you see networked organizations springing up on demand to address particular kind of projects. So a team of 7 emerges to focus on this thing, and they can be designed, if you like, bespoke for that project. And then it disbands and you pull 3 together to do something else, or 12 to do that. That's really interesting, and the challenge again to the way organizations work, so like contracts and all of that messy detail works, liability, all of those things. So it may work better in some areas than others, but it's certainly happening, I think, in most sectors. It actually has a big impact on education as well, of course, which, education for design leadership is pretty woeful, I think. That's one thing that general design education suffers from, is not giving people enough of an understanding of the work that they're going into and the context of that work. So that would absolutely apply at the design leadership educational level as well. Not only profoundly useful, but profoundly important to pull design into new contexts, particularly I think the context of public decision-making, public practice, that kind of area, because it's been woefully without design for a long time. And it's not that design will single-handedly save it or anything. It connects any one tool of has to be a diverse toolkit. But nonetheless, the impact a designer could have around these kind of big questions that the 21st century brings, in the context of public practice and policy making, governance or city making or health, or any one of those sectors, that is profoundly valuable, I think.
Thinking about a growth mindset in relation to hierarchy is quite interesting. The growth mindset sort of asks us, or tells us, that anyone can learn the skills they need with the right intent behind that, and the right experience and growth combination. Considering that the hierarchy in relation to that sort of suggests that people can learn to lead and are ready at varying times over their career. And by mobilising decision-making and influence in all levels of a government organisation, for example, it makes a lot of sense in the way that it responds to the individual, but also the problems that they see, the closer they are to them, in fact. I think mindset and leadership is interesting through the lens of communication and behaviour. What is inside you manifest on the outside, and therefore that's what people see and can connect to. Those behaviours, embodying that mindset on the external, on the outside is everything. In those government relationships at all those different levels, without the right communication, embodying that mindset inside first and then as it manifests on the outside is the core of communication and influence, and the ability to explain and empathise and really sort of highlight the value of what a design-led approach can bring. It really starts with communication. The shift in the organisational models and networks is really interesting as it relates to leadership. And obviously a direct relationship. So as the personal and the professional, or as Dan termed, the portfolio professional who works on multiple things at once, or the overlap between personal and professional where someone works part-time, for example, a parent, and how organisations need to respond to that, what sort of leadership change that would require. Thinking about the project teams, groups of 7, as Dan said, coming together to work on a project for a particular problem, and then disbanding. What does leadership in that arena look like? How does it change? What is that inherently part of the new leadership model for the 21st century? What can we learn from 19th century redundant traditional models when thinking about what these new ways of working may mean, and therefore how leadership can potentially adapt to what new designers and professionals in general are needing now in their lives. The 40-day work week is becoming a thing of the past, but why and how can leadership support and facilitate new ways of working to really get the best talent and really start to understand those overlaps between personal and professional practices. I'm senior in my roles, deciding whether in fact I'll hone in on my craft even further, or whether I'll decide to take that leap into leadership. I think I probably will. Looking back, I've had not as many positive, strong leaders as I would have liked, that I felt have really helped me hone my own craft and my understanding of my own values. I've spent a lot of my professional practice in management consultancies and startups. I did a stint at Telstra, which was really fascinating from a business perspective and from a hierarchical perspective, and from all these different sorts of experiences that you can only get from working inside these companies. What I haven't done, though, is much government work. I've done that from a consultancy side of things, which was great, but generally challenged that work as far as impact is concerned. Sort of popping in, doing 3 to 6 month stint, and withdrawing. And people ask me now, how's it going? How's that government work going? Did it hit the ground? Are they using the design tools you created? And I can't answer them. Perhaps if I still worked in that consultancy, then I would. But I guess with these new ways of working, particularly from a contract perspective, project-based approach, which I've taken for many years, it does really stop you from having, I guess, that long-term view, that ability to see if the work is working, and also come in and make the changes as and when you need to make it more relevant as people leave the organisation, as your champions leave the organisation, to ensure that that work is still on point for what that objective is for the company. I loved when Vanessa said that the design-led approach isn't the only approach, and being a good leader, you need to know what approach is needed for the particular problem or opportunity at hand. I'd love to investigate what she means more. She mentioned hypothesis-driven leadership as well, project practice, with the skills of the leader to know whether to employ multiple approaches or whether one is the right thing, and then bring those together for something truly new. Vanessa's decision to understand design in the language of business is quite close to my heart as well. I've worked on a lot of design projects where it's felt that we haven't hit the mark because we haven't really gotten in there enough. We haven't immersed in their context, understanding their language and their barriers and opportunities. Strategic design, as it leads a lot of capability, I think is particularly cool when it can do that, when it can kind of unpack and respond to those unique business challenges. Using design as a vehicle to de-risk is a really interesting way of looking at design, and one of the greatest things that I've heard around really driving design forward and allowing it to do what it can do. Considering it as the aspect to business where through build, test and refine and rich customer insights that you de-risk a lot of cost and other aspects that go along with releasing a full product launch or MVP into market. The overlay between personal and professional practices piqued my interest as part of this research very much. I feel like, as I was mentioning earlier, that one's ability to find that balance and craft their time, craft their professional and their personal time to really sharpen the saw, as Vanessa referred to, is hugely important and seems like an ongoing struggle, considering all the aspects to people's lives outside of work and the ability of teams and leaders especially to adapt and respond to the needs of individual people. Is really going to connect you with your staff in a way where you do humanise the work more, as Andy Polaine was saying earlier. Dan's example from that book he mentioned about eating the world with your eyes effectively doesn't stop particularly. I mean, yes, there are moments where you are in the moment and spending time with family and friends where you may not be thinking about that, but engaging with the world around you basically happens in the majority of the time. And it becomes interesting then to think about, is there a switch for us, any of us, between our personal and professional practice as designers, or do we in fact overlay different things at certain times, maybe dial one thing up and dial the other down as and when we need to, depending on the situation, but maybe effectively they're always there sort of working in the background or just sort of available to us as and when we need it. Maybe it's about sort of integrating personal and professional practice constantly, where mindset would really be a driver of something like that, where you would start to be able to tap into exactly where you are at a point in time and what you needed to get there. Or perhaps in fact they are completely distinct. Perhaps they are, one or the other. Maybe there is no overlap. I think that maybe there's a balance, there's a potential for a balance there, and I think that's potentially unique to the individual. Finding your own balance, I think, is probably the key there, which is a very personable very personable thing. And where mindset comes into play with that, I think, as the driver for self-awareness and self-identity and what's needed to achieve what you need to achieve and to be well, to really have your own well-being coming first and foremost before you can function or really do a good job that you need to do as a designer and as a leader. The ethics and responsibilities of designers is becoming quite the topic of conversation as well. I think, as a couple of people mentioned, as we start to see the integration of AI and automation and machine learning into a lot of our services and our lives, we're going to need to design for that. we're going to need to design for something that we don't fully understand, that we're not going to understand properly for a long time. How do we do that? How can design help make this transition that we're going through as a world, as a universe, into these new paradigms? And what does human-centered mean in relation to machine language? How can we start to take our practice into that dimension and understand the inner workings of AI and machine, and get in there pretty damn quickly before this sort of takes on its own life. It sounds like designers still have a lot to learn. Like everyone, we should never stop learning, but particularly as human-centered becomes more and more ubiquitous. Our clients, listening to them, really truly understanding what their problems are, seeing it with new eyes, taking our skills in design and showing, telling, helping our clients see themselves in a different way, understanding their problems in a different way. But they're still their problems. And they need to make sense in their context organisationally before they can make sense externally for customers. Design solutions need to adapt to internal strategy, politics, legacy systems, so many hierarchies. It needs to make sense in that context. You need to get a mandate within the organisation behind these design solutions for them to take flight externally. And listening and understanding all of those parameters is, I think, the real challenge of designers going forward. Tapping into that language, breaking it down, putting it back together again in a new way, communicating that new value and that importance, and designing whatever is needed to communicate that, and then not to stop there, to continue to look after that work. In effect, it never ends. It never should end. It needs to continue to be understood once it's released out into the world. The conditions in which the design artifact or outcome exist, they can be known, I think, a lot more than designers pretend that they can be known. But there's still so many unknowns, and it's inherently the responsibility of the design and the designer and the design leader to ensure that that artifact or outcome is on track and it's doing its job, and that there's not any negative surprises or other problems, social problems, environmental problems that can be traced back to it. And understanding the network, or sort of active network theory a little bit, understanding the network between that artifact and the world around it, and the interplay going on.